Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Progress marches on, and we are now armed with new amplification equipment. Can you hear my voice? No. It's wonderful how simple modern gadgets can make your life. The old ones were so complicated and difficult, and we're glad to have these replacements. This evening, we address our attention with the help of two accomplished speakers to what may well be the most fascinating aspect of the prospects for biological control in the future. Those prospects for control of the human brain. This is not simply a narrow professional bias on my part, it's the truth. And the reason I say that with such affirmative confidence is that the nervous system and the brain which guides and controls it constitute the pinnacle of evolution of all the organ systems of all the creatures who have inhabited the earth and have left their descendants upon it today. In the beginning, when one-celled animals populated the warm seas some billions of years ago, all the functions that are now performed by the complicated organisms that we are acquainted with today were performed by those simple one-celled organisms, as are the same functions by the one-celled organisms that still survive. Gradually, the one-celled organisms led to the development of multicellular organisms, which originally were small clusters of cells of all the same kind that lived in a clump. And as the millions of years went by, some of these cells became specialized as sensory cells to bring that whole cluster of one-celled of identical cells information about the world around. They were chemical receptors. In the beginning, gradually they developed into more specialized receptions for vibration, for sound, for light. And gradually these specialized cells became organized into complicated networks, so that when we come to the crustacea, these complicated networks surrounded the oral opening into which all the food was pulled by the currents sucked in from the ocean. And gradually, when the land-dwelling forms emerged, the nervous system, which coordinated the immensely complicated activities of these more developed organisms, began to be cephalized, as the biologists tell us. The brain moved into a compact area at the head end of the organism and became connected with its periphery through long and complicated connections, nerve fibers. Now when we come to man, the numbers of cells in the brain and the numbers of possible connections reached many millions. And in a lecture I heard Saturday night by our friend Mr. Neutra, who has been here other evenings, the interesting comparison was made between any one human brain and the entire total of the telephonic systems in the world. There are more possible connections in a human brain than can be made by the combined telephone systems of the entire Earth. Now, it's no wonder when you stop to think of the complicated activities we are called upon to engage in during any one day. Think of the numbers of things we have to manipulate. The keys, the shoelaces, the forks and knives, the handshakes, the machinery like typewriters and automobiles, the clothing, the buttons, the coins, the directions we have to remember, to go so many blocks this way and then that way and up the elevator and down the hall, and all of that's done automatically, freeing our conscious minds for the fabulously important things that most of us have on them all the time. The brain does all of these things and has for so many hundreds of thousands of years that we expect that this performance will be really perfect without our intervention. And yet man has tried for many thousands of years to influence that brain behavior with such agents, for example, as alcohol. Alcohol, as you know, has been produced and used for its effect on emotional states for many thousands of years. And we go on perfecting other mechanisms and devices for enlarging that control which alcohol in its very tiny way gave primitive man. Today we come to an era in this field, as in so many others, when the control expands geometrically. And we are going to hear something about the frontier of this kind of research from our first speaker, Dr. Bernice Wendyel. Professor Wendyel of the Physiology Department received her undergraduate degree at Beaver College, her master's degree at Columbia, and her doctorate also at Columbia. Subsequently, she taught in a number of different schools at Tulane, Barnard College, Columbia, Los Angeles State College, and since 1956 in various parts of UCLA. She's been a research physiologist and has also worked in the Department of Anatomy. Her professional associations include the Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Institute of Biological Sciences, the Psychological Association, and so on. Her writings cover a tremendous scope also. And remember, all of this activity is integrated by the millions of cells of but one woman's brain. Her papers on olfaction, the sense of smell, are most interesting, on the sequential order of concept attainment, an instance of which you are just at the moment watching. She has written on conditioned responses, on the effects of reserpine on behavior, many other subjects of great interest to me and to many other people. She has worked with a number of different species of animals, including cats and goats, which I think gives her an intimate connection with history. I should include in that connection also the species of pigeons. Now, we will hear later in the evening from a different sort of use to which a different aggregation of those millions of brain cells have been put, and in due course I will introduce to you Professor Kurt von Myer from the Department of Art History. But now it gives me great pleasure, first of all, to realize belatedly that I have not quite forgotten that Municipal Code 57.6 still forbids smoking in this auditorium, all three of them. And secondly, to introduce to you Professor Bernice Wendyel.
I can be heard. I'd rather not hear if I can help it. Thank you. Okay. My purpose tonight is not to shock nor to dramatize my subject, but merely to inform you. I'm no more capable than anyone else of predicting the future, although I do think that it's of great interest to consider the future and to speculate about its possibilities. In any area, there are, of course, different degrees of futureness. So we can talk about things that are here right now, but which to you may sound quite revolutionary and which may seem futuristic. And we can also talk about things that are not at all on the immediate horizon and which to me sound horrendous because we have as yet almost no scientific justification for predicting them. I hope in the very limited time I have to span this entire spectrum, and perhaps it won't be clear to you where I am, but if I sort of wince from time to time, you may assume that I'm talking, as far as I'm concerned, way beyond my data. Before launching into the actual content, I'd like to ask you to speculate with me for just a moment why this lecture is the only one in this series which is concerned with a specific organ system of the body. All the other lectures have been on processes, on interpersonal relations, on gestation, and so forth. This is the only one that has singled out a specific organ. There's no lecture on control of the heart, for instance, or control of the kidney, or the little finger, or anything else. It seems to me that the reason for this unique attention to a certain part of the body is because that organ is equivalent for most of us to the I, to the me. It is the individual. So if anyone is controlling my brain, he's controlling me. If someone is controlling my heart, he's doing me a favor. Touché. If a physician is, by means of an electric switch, controlling the rate at which my heart beats when I'm in dire need of that kind of life-giving resuscitation, he's doing me a favor. And similarly, if he attaches me to a pump, a cleaning mechanism which functions as in lieu of my kidneys, which are not doing their proper job, he's also doing me a favor. But if that same dastardly fellow replaced my brain, which might have been failing, heaven knows, without my realizing it, with another brain, I would regard this as not doing me a favor, probably, but rather as replacing my identity. And I'm not at all sure, even though I'm not always happy with myself, that I want my identity replaced in this high-handed fashion. I'm reminded of a colleague of mine who at one point suffered a rather battered toe. And as he was limping down the hall past my door one day, I asked him how he was. And he said, "Do you mean me or my toe?" And so I questioned him as to where he really began. And it turned out that not very much of him was really he. But his brain most decidedly was he. Now, the very fact that we're not anywhere near being able to provide an artificial brain, while artificial hearts are really becoming almost run-of-the-mill, indicates the lag in understanding of neurophysiology, or the function of the nervous system, and primarily for our purposes tonight, the brain. Our understanding is really very meager compared with our understanding of some of the other organ systems of the human body. This may be because the system is a more complex one, or it may be because we just haven't made very much progress. I'm not prepared to comment on these possibilities. The history of neurophysiology is really rather brief and has represented a painful break with shall I say, less mechanistic or less physicalistic attempts to explain behavior. It's approximately 200 years ago that it was discovered that animal nerves and muscles respond in essentially normal fashion to the application of electrical stimulation. And it's only about 100 years ago that this observation was extended to the exposed animal brain. So a tiny bit of electrical current applied to the exposed brain of an anesthetized dog was shown to be able to elicit movements of the limbs of that dog that had a great deal in common with the movements that the dog made when it was up and running around. And it's only approximately 75 years ago that a rather crude technique was developed for applying such electrical stimulation to the brain of an intact animal without having to expose the brain and without having to anesthetize the animal. And it's approximately 50 years ago that electrical currents were first recorded from the intact human brain through the skull and scalp without doing any surgery at all. In the last decade or two, it has really become commonplace to insert these very fine wires into the brains of experimental animals as a regular surgical procedure, and then to let the animal recover from the anesthetic and the effects of surgery. And we then have a way of making direct contact with that animal's brain, either for the purpose of recording the intrinsic electrical activity of the brain tissue, or for the purpose of imposing our own electrical currents on that brain for purposes of finding out what happens when different areas of the brain are stimulated in this way. You see the point, I'm sure. The imposed electrical current that we control from the outside stands in lieu of the normal electrical activity that would be going on in that animal's brain under certain circumstances. We just don't want to be bothered waiting around for those circumstances to arrive. We'd rather initiate them ourselves. So, of course, other developments are proceeding extremely rapidly in neurophysiology along the way. I'm only detailing the history of one line of investigation. But at the present time, the rate of new scientists starting out in this field is accelerating very rapidly. The rate of accumulation of information is going up on some very steeply sloping curve, so that in the next, decade? I don't know what unit to pick, but let's say decade. In the next decade, the amount of information that's going to be available in this area is going to be so much greater than the amount that we've collected in this past decade that 10 years from now, you'd have to have a gigantic computer up here summarizing this for you. One individual couldn't do it, I'm sure. The progress in neurophysiology has been very dependent on development of technology, and we're still very dependent on technology. So some of the things that I say will theoretically be possible in some future out there, I don't know exactly when, will be possible provided we have the technology to permit the kinds of activities that I'm going to mention. So you engineers have a great deal to say about what happens in the next several years in this area. That reminds me of a statement that the poet Rilke once wrote, where he said that the future enters into us to transform itself in us long before it happens. And I think this is a nice thought to keep in mind in connection with this series. Knowing about some of these possibilities will inevitably have something to do with the possibilities themselves as they eventually arrive. Now, I've talked about this procedure of implanting little wires into brains, and I referred to experimental animals. This has been, as I say, quite commonplace for 10 or 15 years now. You go into any physiology laboratory anywhere in the United States and in most reasonably progressive countries in the world, and you will see animals cavorting about very happily with little plugs in their heads through which you can make connections. It is also possible to equip the animals in such a way that you don't have to make a direct connection at all, but can stimulate them by remote control, by something like radio waves, where there's no visible connection between you and the animal. This is also being done with human beings now. And this is a point where, if any of you don't know this, you may feel that I'm talking about the future when I'm really talking about the present and the recent past. These wires are being put into human brains on a volunteer basis now, I hasten to assure you, for therapeutic purposes. These are always individuals who are abnormal in some way, who will benefit, presumably, from this kind of experimental approach. Now, what have we learned from all of this? We've learned, from now on I'm talking only about the animals, not about the human beings. we've learned that it is possible, by means of this kind of stimulation, to cause an animal to make movements, and these movements may be very fine movements. They're not just gross contortions, convulsions, or anything like that. They're fine, directed movements comparable to those that the animal would make if he were moving about in his normal fashion. So if we stimulate at a certain point which is concerned with the elicitation of flexion of a forelimb, and the animal is standing on all four legs at the time we turn this stimulation on, the animal not only flexes his limb and in so doing falls over because he's unbalanced, all of the compensatory postural adjustments are made as well, so that he does not fall over. He shifts his weight, lifts this leg. In other words, it's a full coordinated movement. We can then elicit movements at will. We can stimulate areas which are concerned with the reception of incoming information. Dr. Gorney spoke of the development of sensory cells that are concerned with delivering information to the rest of the body so that this vast mass that has no direct contact with the environment can know what's going on and what it should do about it. We can stimulate areas then concerned with reception of this information in such a way that we presume we're causing the animal to have experiences comparable to what it would have if we were providing some normal kind of visual or auditory or tactile stimulation in the environment. But we can go far beyond that. We can stimulate in such a way that the animal goes to sleep. If he's asleep, we can wake him up by this kind of stimulation. And these are specific points in the brain that are concerned. I don't mean just that if you bombard the brain with electrical stimuli, a sleeping animal is going to wake up. This is not the point. There are many, many parts of the brain where if you stimulate, a sleeping animal does not wake up. You have to know where to stimulate in order to have this effect. We can apparently provide the animal with unpleasant experiences and with pleasant experiences by this kind of stimulation. And I can't now go into the evidence for this statement. The fact is then that we can obtain a rather fine degree of control over this animal's existence. And a very dramatic example of this was publicized extensively and quite understandably recently when a Yale physiologist who has done a great deal of the work in this area implanted some electrodes in the crucial part of a bull's brain and then went into the ring. This is a physiologist whose heritage is Spanish, by the way, who then went into a Spanish bull ring with this bull, which he always refers to as a brave bull, and the bull started a charge, and he flicked his little transmitter. There were no wires. This was a remote control affair. Flicked his little transmitter, and the bull stopped dead and became just very, very docile about the whole thing. And the physiologist heaved a sigh of relief, I assume, having proved his point, and quickly left the ring. This kind of information, then, not only enables us to make predictions about what will happen if we do A, B, C, D, or E, but because the technology is sufficiently well advanced, it also enables us to exert the controls. Understanding relationships is of course something that comes from intensive study of any subject in science or anything else. Once you understand the relationships, then it's theoretically possible to make control, to exert control over these relationships. By manipulating the antecedents, you can control the outcome. It's theoretically possible now, then, to put these electrodes into human brains and have similar effects. The data that we've been able to collect from human subjects essentially supports or agrees with the data that we have collected from animals. So that so far there is no reason to think that the human brain is going to respond in any basically different way from these animal brains that we've been studying. We could, therefore, exert this kind of control over a human being now if we felt it was an appropriate thing to do. And a fine old proverb, by the way, has bit the dust with all this. The old saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Have to give that one up. If you have your electrode in the right place, you can not only get that horse to the water, but you can make him drink copiously, even though he has just filled himself up with water someplace else. Now, another area of investigation which has not advanced to the point, I think, of the one I've just been describing, but which has vast implications, I'm going to classify very loosely as chemical. And under this, I'll put two headings. One is represented, and these are kind of arbitrary divisions I'm making. One is represented by the psychoactive drugs. And Dr. Gorney has already mentioned our good old standby, alcohol, and you're getting all the publicity you need to get about another one right now, namely LSD. But there are many chemical compounds which have been developed by pharmacologists and are being tested, sometimes on animals and sometimes on human subjects as well, for their influence on what I'm loosely calling the psychic life of the individual, whether it be a cat or a goat or another human being. We know perfectly well that this kind of manipulation works. We do not, as yet, understand the mechanisms by which it works. And until we do, we can't even really make very basic predictions, let alone exert any real control. The point is that that we will know this eventually, and it will be possible, sooner or later, to manipulate chemicals in such a way that they can have perhaps even finer control over broad functions of behavior than the electrical stimulation that I've been describing. Now, another area that I'm putting under chemical investigations is entirely different. It has to do with an understanding of the basic mechanisms of neural action. Ultimately, the phenomenon of the nerve impulse, of brain function, reduces, at least partially, to chemical terms. And when these terms are understood, then it will be possible to exert such control as now it's not even very easy to imagine, I think. One of the difficulties in thinking about future possibilities in an area like this is that we're still so far from understanding the basic mechanisms that we can't even quite grasp the nature of the controls that are going to come up, because we're so many steps still removed. But, for example, we're already just a little way into this area of understanding the chemistry, so it is possible now to do a little bit by chemical therapy of abnormal brain conditions. But this is a very, very little bit. So far, this activity has functioned solely in the therapeutic realm. It is possible now, though, to do something like the electrical stimulation by means of hormones. So, for example, a tiny, tiny little bit of a hormone, a certain hormone, can be injected into a specific part of the brain, and a whole behavior pattern will emerge. A tiny little bit of an appropriate hormone can be injected into the appropriate part of a rabbit brain, and that rabbit will start, if it's a male rabbit, it may start acting as if it were a mother rabbit. It appears then that whole systems of what we'll call instinctive behavior are built in genetically to animal brains, and there's every reason to think that ours follow this similar patterns, which can be triggered by an appropriate chemical impulse. But far more than that, sooner or later we'll know the chemistry of the individual nerve cell. We know a great deal about it now, but not enough to exert any control over it. But we'll know how to control its activities in such a way that it might even be possible, for example, to concoct experiences in the test tube and just inject them into a person. You haven't seen Paris yet? Never mind. Here's a test tube of a Paris injection. This is obviously nonsense. It's not the way it's going to be at all. But I can't put it into words the way it's going to be. As I say, we're so far from understanding it. I think this possibility, however, is so vast in its implications that one needs to stand in awe of it. It will have all kinds. It will offer all sorts of possibilities for therapy. Probably many kinds of conditions, neuropathological conditions, which now are completely remote or inaccessible for anything more than diagnosis, will be curable, and more than that, will be preventable. And beyond that, it may very well be possible to transform a brain that we would now consider normal into one with different behavior patterns by means such as this. Finally, I'd like to raise, and now I'm wincing and I'm way out in the future. I'd like to raise the possibility of synthetic brains. What do I mean by that? We now have things that are called mechanical brains, are called computers. They're called various things depending on your attitude toward them. But at any rate, they do things that seem uncannily and uncomfortably and sometimes admirably like the things that the human brain does. They can perform mathematical feats far more rapidly than any human being can. They can remember far more perfectly than any human being can. But their activities and their responses are completely limited by the material that a human being puts into them. So all that they are great, big, inefficient human subbrains, let's say. They can carry on some of our functions because we've built them to do so. But they can't take over any functions that we don't tell them to perform. And they, as I say, they do it inefficiently in the sense of having to fill a room this big to do a tiny fraction of the things we do with a neat little package like this in here. This then is not is only a minor step along the way. And these computers that now seem very grand to us will seem pretty poor stuff someday. In fact, the early computers now are pathetic things that have been junked in most places and can't find a home. There are two points about this new kind of synthesis that I'd like to mention. It's already possible to do two kinds of things with animal brain tissue, human brain tissue, if you will. One is that it can now be preserved beyond the, quote, life of the individual to function in something like its normal fashion at a later time. This has not been done, as far as I know, with the human brain, but it has been done with an animal brain, I think a cat. The reason I put life, that it was preserved beyond the life, in quotes, of the individual is because we said earlier this evening that the brain is the individual. You kind of have this subjective feeling. And yet here we say the cat has died, but the brain lives on. So where do we stand? Is this little package that we have here, which has been frozen and then thawed out under very special circumstances and continues to show the same electrical activity that was recorded from it while it was inside the cat, getting all its blood in the usual way and controlling the limbs and all the rest of the cat in the usual way. Electrically, for the limited way in which we can measure this now, it appears to be essentially the same brain. Is that the cat that we have there? If we could put that into another cat and have the transplant take, what would that donor cat do? How would it perform? If we had trained the first cat to do all sorts of things, would the donor cat now start prancing about doing these things? Presumably, yes. Nobody knows. Now, this is one approach to synthetic brains, if you will. It's not synthetic in the sense of having been concocted out of a test tube, but it's far more than we can do today for practical purposes. It's preserving a brain for later time. Another thing that we can do now is culture, is grow nerve cells. We can take neural tissue from an organism, from a living organism, and put it in in a separate nourishing medium, and it will grow. It's completely outside of a living organism at this point, but it's growing, and it has many of the functional properties of a nerve cell that we study inside an organism in the usual way. Well, this kind of growth has not at all developed to the point where it makes even an inadequate brain. It's just a cell, and an organ has not been grown in this. A neural organ has not been grown in this way, but it's a beginning. Another thing that can be done is that. Well, I'm being a little controversial now. It appears that we're on the brink of being able to create life in a test tube. That is, combine inanimate chemicals and, under proper circumstances, produce something that meets the criteria for life, although the constituent parts that we started with did not in themselves meet these criteria. Now put all of this together, and you reach the inevitable conclusion that someday, somewhere, somehow, it will be possible to create something that has the characteristics of brain tissue as we know it now, functioning normally in an intact, normal animal. And when this is going to happen, I haven't the faintest idea. What form it will take, I haven't the faintest idea. What functions it will carry on, I really don't know. I just see somewhere on the horizon something like this as an almost inevitable possibility. I said in the beginning that it was not my intention to shock or to dramatize. I hope I have not. I've tried very hard to restrict myself to material that I consider essentially factual. It seems to me that simply in discussing material at this level, the implications for an interesting future, if no more than interesting, are enormous. Thank you.
Now that Dr. Wendyel has laid the groundwork for our understanding of the potentials for control of the brain, we will have the opportunity to hear from a member of our art history department, Professor Kurt von Myer, about some of the reflections which this new area in human progress will have in a field that depends essentially upon the function of brain for its existence and its advance. Dr. von Myer was born in San Francisco, and since that time has covered the globe in his intrepid search for understanding of what he's going to tell us this evening. I hope you realize that tonight is really the high point of his career. He attended Monterey Peninsula College and the University of California at Berkeley, was forced to take a sojourn in between some of his academic activity in order to take care of things for us in Korea. Following that, he came back to Berkeley and graduated in international relations in 1958. He is one of the few individuals I've ever known personally who then specialized in Middle Eastern languages, Arabic and Persian, and at the same time distinguished himself in the field of athletics as a rugby player for the university. You remember I explained to you that the brain is capable of coordinating a vast, disparate array of activities. Dr. von Myer is not content to restrict himself to the ordinary academic halls for his education, and supplemented the more formal parts of it by spending a postgraduate summer at a gambling casino in Nevada. Which I hope you will understand as a way of learning about the important segment of human affairs known as probability. Following these experiences, he then specialized in Spanish art and civilization and traveled extensively in Spain and North Africa, Germany, the Low Countries, and England. A fellowship at Princeton led to a Master of Fine Arts degree there, and following this, in 1962, Professor von Myer then went to New Zealand, where he founded a course in the history and theory of fine arts at the University of Auckland. These details, I think, will be important when you consider the scope of the ideas he will present to us this evening. There followed a period in Australia, teaching and studying there, and finally a PhD degree at Princeton, subsequent to which the kind of body snatching that goes on in the academic community was successful in bringing him to enrich the campus at UCLA. Now, he's written and published articles on architecture, recent paintings and drawings of Robert Ellis, a computer-based classification system for the fine arts, and contemporary painting in New Zealand. It's not an accident that I have hoped to bring together on one platform a fine artist and an art historian to bring to us the perspective on the kinds of things which Dr. Wendyel has so ably described as potentials. Now we will hear from Professor Kurt von Myer.
I supplemented my education at the casino. I didn't finance it there. My concern is with prospects for control of the human brain and their implications for aesthetics and the fine arts. Now, there are two principal ways in which our relationship to the work of art may be controlled. Its activity in some way directed or modified. First of these is the activity of creation of the work of art itself. It is in conceiving or the actual making of the work of art, its formulation and its formation. Secondly, it's in our response to that work of art or a series of works of art. An activity for which at least the work of art or part of it is a given. We differentiate this in the general discipline of art history by referring to art theory on the one hand, directed towards production of a work of art or creation of it, and aesthetics on the other, our response to it. Now, many of the decisions that are commonly or generally referred to as aesthetic decisions are in fact involved in the creative process, so there's a distinction to be made there. But in a broader sense anyway, an aesthetic decision may generally be distinguished from other decisions non-aesthetic in nature, such as logical decisions, practical decisions, random decisions. And decisions of choice, aesthetic decisions, may include many subcategories too that have nothing or very little to do with works of art, such as moral, ethical judgments about beauty or whether something moves us. For the brain may be controlled with respect to the fine arts when either creating or reacting to a work of art, although both of these, as I'll suggest later, are really creative activities. Now, there are several ways of modifying the brain's creative activity. Stimulation through the use of hallucinogenic drugs has been suggested by Dr. Wendyel, but it's difficult at this stage anyway to control or to predict the results of any such control. There are important possibilities, I think, for LSD or amphetamine drugs like this in conditioning, or alcohol for that matter, in some painters, for conditioning their creativity. There are other mechanisms of control, however, that seem to be more direct or that exert a more explicit control, which depend upon our greater understanding of the human brain structure and mode of operation. And today, this too is in a relatively primitive state. But one potentially fruitful line of speculation posits an analogy between the human brain and a machine. Now, if the human brain is a machine like any other machine we know, and operating on the basis of a formal procedure similar to any that we can now conceive, it must manifest at least 3 steps of machine procedure. The first of these would be instruction or input of information, which corresponds to punch tape on a computer, or artistic training or education, really. The second of these would be the physical operation of the machinery of the brain itself, the carrying out of instruction, the translating of these into possible or potential actions. And the third step would be then the result or the output, again corresponding to a punch tape on a computer or to the actual activity itself. Now, there are some doubts as to just how closely the actual operation of the brain in the step 2, the mechanical operation of it, is analogous to that of a machine. These have been expressed very recently, in fact, by Bernice in an article, The Logic of the Mind, in the American Scientist of March this year. He concludes that nature, or the human brain, cannot be represented in the form of a Turing machine, a machine in the idea of A.M. Turing, a mathematician who has written on the limitations of logic, or the difficulties in testing for truth and falsity. Turing machine would be analogous to a basic set of axioms in arithmetic from which there are formal deductions that can be derived and expressed in an exact language. But our understanding of just how the brain does work can be at least partially characterized, anyway, by a machine operation, and with machine language simulating a series of logical languages employed by the functioning of the human brain. These are physical, chemical, and electrical in a general sense, among others, perhaps. Despite the relative primitiveness of our understanding, some of these processes can be approximated by extra-organismic brains, of which a computer is a primitive example. Others that Dr. Wendyel has suggested. One speculative problem is how to control or teach or program such a brain to create a work of art. Now, some of the stimulating possibilities of such a project, as well as the difficulties and complexities of it, are suggested by a series of problems that I've been working on with Mr. Charles Kessler here at the university, connected with the analysis of paintings by Piet Mondrian. Mondrian, who was a Dutch artist working in the 20th century, who died in 1944 in New York. Mondrian's paintings are particularly susceptible to this analysis because they're very clean, they're very intellectual paintings. There is a very fine one in the Los Angeles County Museum, composed essentially of right angles, black lines on a white surface, and 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. So what sort of art, we may ask, would the extra-organismic brain create? Conceivably, it could be programmed to create art in the style of any person or period we choose, like Mondrian or Rembrandt, or in the manner of a 5th century BC classical Greek sculptor, for that matter. There are certain practical advantages to considering first, at least the formally simpler work of an artist like Mondrian. This painting is amenable to logical analysis in a way that a Rembrandt is not. It can also be more simply characterized and related to a machine language such as that we could program into a computer. Its composition in terms of right angles, in terms of primary colors and straight lines, Mondrian very seldom employs curves, and the fact that there are many dated works that are available for stylistic analysis in order to derive the basic principles for construction in order to characterize the input to the computer in the first place. There's a good statistical sampling of work from about 1917 to 1944. The procedure then is roughly this. You establish a chronological sequence and a stylistic grouping of the individual paintings, and from these you derive certain rules or principles for applying to your composition of a pseudo-Mondrian. Your stylistic analysis produces general rules which apply to all of Mondrian's works being considered. And in a more qualified sense, there are rules that apply only to specific periods or stylistic phases with a degree of consistency. The program is written with the rules expressed negatively, because the computer generates random numbers which then provide the direction for composition of this painting and corresponding directions, and the negative rules then exclude possibilities that are not acceptable to the computer. It doesn't matter. Once you have these rules, you can express it either positively or negatively. It's the same thing to a computer. So all these directions are rejected except those which do not violate the increasingly selective rules of consistency, so that a painting, once you've started it and it seems to be taking the shape of a Mondrian of the early 1920s, then it will follow that it's consistent in its development possibilities. Some directions that might be acceptable for a late Mondrian of the early 40s, say, would at that point be rejected, whereas in another case they might be accepted. The mechanical execution of the painting itself presents a separate series of problems. These are minimized with the current impersonal approaches to technique, and which in some ways were employed by Mondrian too. I'm thinking of contemporary painting that uses acrylic paints, where the individual brush stroke is minimized in its aesthetic appeal. In fact, it's very definitely de-emphasized. Anyway, there are less obvious problems for Mondrian than there are for Rembrandt. Even the qualities of paint texture, however, the thickness of the impasto, the gloss, or the relative matte quality of the surface, these could conceivably be controlled as well. So the Neo-Mondrian compositions would reproduce no single painting ever executed by Mondrian, but the painting or series of paintings it produced would anyway be consistent or relatively consistent with rules derived from all of these paintings. At least it would be consistent in that art historians talk about a contextual relativism of styles, the fact that within a given period there are some things that are consistent and coherent, while these may change at other periods. These compositions could be progressively corrected, not only with result to their immediate visual presentation, but also with respect to Mondrian's written theories. He was a very intelligent painter and wrote quite a bit concerning his art. Plastic art and pure plastic art are two essays in point. One test of the success of these compositions would be whether a Neo-Mondrian could fool the experts or not. Some of the experts on Mondrian are pretty good. Presumably, if such a painting could fool the experts consistently, it would be very closely analogous to the creative process that Mondrian would manifest were he alive. You could also have extrapolation on this too. Following the stylistic development of Mondrian, for instance, we might create a work that Mondrian could have created had he lived to the year 1945 or 1966. I think this becomes less and less interesting the farther you get away, because you're still you're simply assuming evidence in order to extrapolate upon. So the closer you are to his actual life, I think the more accurate you are. The results of such a project might be found to have immediate application by art historians and critics, or connoisseurs, or even archaeologists who are concerned with interpreting, dating, or authenticating certain works of art, indeed, in erecting the logical structures or hypothetical structures of styles and their developments. Once such an organismic brain or extraorganismic brain has been successfully programmed to create works of art in this sense, there are the further possibilities of applying such a program to a human brain. Once you have the program, then you can re-enter it through these mechanisms that Dr. Wenzel has described, such as electrodes inserted in the brain. I'm unfamiliar with all the technological and the biological problems involved in this, and or the means by which it may be accomplished, although certainly the possibilities for this seem to be foreboding anyway. In one sense, the results would be closely comparable to any other learning process, judging by the results of this, so that we could enter this information into the human brain, and this essentially is what learning involves. Theoretically, we could equip a person then with the aesthetic attitudes of a Mondrian, or of a Rembrandt, or of a Phidias, or of any other Greek 5th century BC classical sculptor. Now, of course, the person would not actually look at the world through the eyes of Phidias, say, unless we also blocked out those responses that are the result of his modern non-5th century BC experience, and in their place simulated a complex program of 5th century BC experiences to take their place. And this has several historical problems, to be sure. But although almost inconceivably demanding now, such a program, again, revised and corrected by all available documentary, historical, and archaeological sources and evidence, such a program might someday be approximated. Certainly it would be a lot easier for periods in the relatively recent past. How then would such a Neophytean brain respond to the stimulus of a piece of sculpture by Rodin, or by Giacometti, or even by Michelangelo, or to an abstract work by Brancusi, or by David Smith, or Harold Paris, or contemporary sculptors? Even without the clinical perfection or simulation of such a total response, it would be clearly an easy matter to effect a coupling of systems with their related aesthetic responses, so that new programs could be added to others that were the result of the individual's own earlier experiences and learning. You couple this new program sequence onto the sequence that already exists in the organic brain. For example, some entirely new and extraordinary art might result from an individual who, say, after receiving a BA degree from the art department at UCLA, incorporated into his own brain the programs for Phidias and Michelangelo. And what kind of work would he do? There are some implications for the process of education here, too, because it makes the learning and training process of an artist certainly much more efficient and economical. I mean, if you can just plug into Michelangelo and have the whole program there very painlessly. But then, I don't know, there are other problems suggested. Suppose the student gets greedy and he starts to add Rembrandt and Picasso and Van Gogh and El Greco and Mondrian and Edward Kienholz to his own brain. That's a good measure. One of the most serious questions for aesthetics, anyway, is what such a new art might look like. Would it be inhuman? Would it be inhuman stylistically because it's the result of a computerized program and not because it's the result of the actual experiences of living? Would it have qualities of depersonalization, for instance? I don't think it would be insofar as the programmed material is incorporated into the healthy human brain on the same basis as other learned responses. But the control of aesthetics raises a major problem that is related to this, and that is the aesthetics of control. As much of the contemporary painting and sculpture already appears to be depersonalized and too machine-like in some senses for those of us who prefer Rembrandt to Peter de Hoogh, or Bellini to Piero della Francesca, or if you prefer early Kandinsky to late Kandinsky, or if you prefer Matisse to Mondrian, then it's quite possible that a lot of contemporary art might appear to be very depersonalized already. But even with the severely reduced forms and their highly intellectualized relationships, Mondrian remained basically mystical in his approach to art. In his obsession with purity and order, John Copeland's from Irvine campus has suggested that Mondrian is, in effect, almost an expressionist artist. In Mondrian's writing, we discover that his art is an objective manifestation of a deeply personal and philosophically subjective cosmology. He is very much aware of Neoplatonic thought, and the right angle, for example, symbolizes the basic structure of the cosmos, the yin and the yang, the positive and negative, male and female, and this sort of duality that's almost not only Neoplatonic and Christian in some of its references, but Zoroastrian in some of its history. Anyway, suggests a very mystical basis for this apparently very objective art. It's terribly disarming. But even without this sort of art historical information about Mondrian, I think you could, by a very close examination of his painting, deduce this personal involvement, this very definite expression of personality, by stylistic means, by analysis alone. There's Mondrian's very personal brushstroke in some of the black lines. They're not just black lines, they're painted. You can see the brush strokes. The fact that the black lines are recessed in white areas of paint that are built up, whereas if you look at a reproduction of a Mondrian, it looks quite clearly like the black lines have been painted on top of the white ground. Well, this is not the case. And again, the whites are not all white. Some of them are very, very subtly tinted, shaded with other colors. And the red, even though he uses, by and large, only 3 primary colors, the red is not always the same red. So there are these very conscious decisions, very subtle aesthetic decisions that Mondrian does in fact manifest, and that makes us be very cautious about saying that these paintings are in fact expressions of impersonality. Well, in a sense, of course, there are parallels in mathematics and other branches of the sciences. I've been particularly interested in mathematics because one of the 20th century's great mathematicians, John von Neumann, has taken the stand quite strongly that almost all of the decisions made by mathematicians are aesthetic in nature. So the so-called objective or most exact of the sciences is really grounded upon aesthetic decisions, situations that in the extreme anyway wind up by being aesthetic. Particularly, there are questions of mathematical expression, mathematical style in the presentation of certain proofs, and a very big and complex argument in mathematics deriving from George Cantor's theory of sets that involved Bertrand Russell and Weil and Elie Brouwer and several others, involving the concept of rigor. Now, rigor is basically a decision that a mathematician makes on aesthetic grounds about what proof he'll accept or what degree of rigor he demands from a proof. There are other mathematical concepts that von Neumann has written about or suggested might be investigated. Elegance is another criterion that is essentially aesthetic in nature, so that one of the criteria for publishing mathematical proof is its degree of elegance. Not its degree of truth, which in one sense, you see, it's either true or it's not true. But if it's more elegant, then it'll be published. If it's less elegant, it won't be. Aesthetics itself is a creative activity in the sense of response to the work of art, and this is already implied in the brilliant writing of Oscar Wilde, in the work of Marcel Duchamp, and in the aesthetic implications of the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. There's basically a position that I refer to as a neo-Berkeleyanism. That is, the work of art is not simply an object, it's an event that involves the relationship of human beings to the thing, both in the creative act and in a sense we are all creators insofar as we respond to this work of art. So there's a creativity on both ends here. Now, it should be clear that there are possibilities for both active and passive manifestations of prospects for control of the human brain then. So returning to our original distinction between art theory, concerned with the creation of the work of art, and aesthetics, which is concerned with our response to it, such programs for control of the brain could be applied simply to modify the ways in which we respond to the world aesthetically. Research in this direction may help objectify some of our, at this time anyway, very rudimentary types of understanding about the nature of the aesthetic response itself. But the potential value of such research is not restricted to such abstract and somewhat impersonal academic or scientific attitudes, simply finding out more about our responses, or that sees in the act of searching for meaning or truth its own justification and reward. Some of the practical applications of control are unfortunately not necessarily very pleasant. Its specific regard to aesthetics, it's very well demonstrated by historical evidence that there is in authoritarian and totalitarian states the strongest desire for programs of control. This is historically true with Nazi Germany, but also with relatively benevolent totalitarian states like the France of Louis XIV. They're all very much concerned with aesthetics and control of them. Presumably, when we have this power, then, it is such states will be the first to pick up these methods of control and to apply them. In fact, with the exception of some efforts in psychological warfare, the practical and effective power of aesthetic control has been largely overlooked by democracies. Or there has been, as in America anyway, a strong individualistic tradition which has effectively resisted any aesthetic control. Whether the propensity for this exists on the parts of governments today, I'm not prepared to suggest. Nevertheless, the possibility that the power to program aesthetic responses, and indeed other activities of the mind as well, might be misused presents a very real threat. On the other hand, it could also become a great force for alleviating human suffering and for contributing to the sum total of human joy. Some of the most promising possibilities for using such program aesthetic responses are possibly in the field of psychiatry. If there is a positive correlation between aesthetic involvement in the world, whether creatively or in the sense of making works of art, or passively in the sense of creating them by our response to them, if there's a correlation between this and mental health, then in cases of mental illness or brain damage, the introduction of a programmed set of aesthetic responses could prove to be of very significant therapeutic value. Again, this does not mean that all aesthetic responses would be controlled, but rather that there would be a coupling of systems with a new potentiality for creative activity and for deriving aesthetic pleasure from experiencing and perceiving the world being added to that system of aesthetic responses already a part of the individual's experience. In the realm of aesthetics, then, and art generally, the prospects for control of the brain inevitably present some problems with profound moral and ethical implications. But they also may help us to replace much hopeless human suffering with meaning and joy, leading us at the same time to a deeper and clearer comprehension of that activity which has contributed the most sublime and beautiful experiences to human history. Thank you.
I would like to draw your attention as you're formulating your questions to one significant aspect of Dr. von Myer's vision of what may be accomplished in conjunction with the prospects that Dr. Wendyel outlined, and that is that not only may a human brain perhaps one day be programmed so that the aesthetics, let's say, of a Mondrian or Michelangelo could be appreciated directly, but the individual who chose to do so might arrange to have himself connected up for Michelangelo for 6 months and himself produce pseudo-Michelangelos. He could then see the world as a creator with the creative experience in his own life at the present time that would be based on an analysis of that experience and that creation which Michelangelo has left to us. Now, the next 6 months, he might perhaps plug himself into a program for Cézanne. And then each scene that he looked at and chose to draw, he could draw as Cézanne did. The prospects for enslavement and ruination of the individual, which are opened by these possibilities, as Dr. von Myer has pointed out, are more than matched, providing they are used with respect for the individual, by the enormous prospects for the increased freedom of the individual to experience in his lifetime a succession of opportunities which would never have been possible in the past. I find this very intriguing. And I want to remind you that next week we will have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Goodwin about some more details concerning the possibilities, for instance, for transplanting the brain and for preserving it after the death of the individual organism. He will show us some slides that illustrate such procedures. The following week, the last symposium, Dr. Arnold Mandel will be one of the participants, who is a co-worker in a way with Dr. Wendyel, and will tell us about some of the more fascinating aspects of the control of mood and behavior and attitude, which has now been accomplished by brain implantation electrode techniques. Complete changes of character are possible during the time the current is on. There are indications, for example, that you can stimulate areas which will produce repetitive pleasurable experience. Porpoises have delighted themselves to death. Well, to start our discussion, I would like to ask Dr. Wendyel or Dr. von Myer if they would care to make an inquiry of one another or a comment. And then we will have a few questions, and I will take the speakers then next door for a few questions and bring them back to close the evening. Would you like to make a comment, either of you, or ask a question?
The only thing I'd like to ask Dr. Wenzel is how soon does she think it'll be before we're both out of a job?
See, that's why I don't want to get into specifics on this. I think we'll make it in our lifetime.
All right. The floor is open for questions.
I'd like to ask Dr. Wenzel if the body, or any living body, man or animal, can be likened unto a low-voltage chemical and electronic unit.
Well, yes, in general. I wonder what specifically you had in mind, though. Well, I was going to say obviously we're low voltage because we don't light up a bulb when we pick it up. A great deal of physiological processes are at least partly involved with electrochemical properties. If you record between 2 points, you will often note, if you have sufficiently good amplification and sufficiently suitable meters, you'll note a potential difference between 2 points, and this is particularly true, of course, in the nervous system, where the coin of the realm, so to speak, is electrical. It talks to itself in electrical terms. I don't know what you were thinking of.
For the sake of research and understanding.
Definitely. You have to think of it, you have to be acquainted with electrical terms and be accustomed to thinking in these terms in order to do this kind of research.
I wanted to ask Dr. von Myer a question. I was a bit confused because from the little I talked to the art students here, it seemed that even now, without all the sophisticated computer type of apparatus you suggested would be necessary to have this kind of art reproduction or imitation, whatever the word is, it seems that there are all sorts of competent artists who could, by studying, let's say, Michelangelo or Da Vinci, can go out and copy. It's called, using the word, let's say, copying his style, or produce something where you look and say, oh, gee, he does it just like Van Gogh does. And that can be done now without all kinds of fantastic computers. But my question is, so what? In other words, don't you personally know, let's say, 20 people, or couldn't you put your hands on 20 people who could go out and draw 100 things that look just like and are just like, let's say, Mondrian? But so what? Mondrian's done it. Isn't the idea not to go onward as the centuries go on from 5 centuries BC, to do different things and to expand the frontiers of art? That's all.
Whether I have a job or not, I think that artists always will have a job. I agree with you very much there. The implications of this project on Mondrian, you recognize a very low-level sort of project. I'm interested in creating a painting according to the principles that Mondrian seemed to employ, whether conscious or not, a painting that Mondrian didn't create. Now, its immediate value, I think, is with respect to analysis and the precision, the honing to precise valence of critical terminology. Before we can begin to make sense out of this vast and complicated series of experiences known as aesthetic responses, we've got to start someplace, and this would seem to me to be a pretty good place to start. I suggest that it could be used by an artist in the same way that any other set of experiences can be used by him, and from which, if he copies directly, it's certainly very close to the borderline of being non-art or art, depending upon which side there. I don't think that the humanity of this process of creativity ever is absent, though, because you have a human being involved, and he will couple this system of experiences with which he is programmed newly with that set of experiences that he already has as a human being, so it won't be the same as Mondrian. In fact, that would be a very difficult situation to arrive at clinically, I should imagine.
included an idea as to the degree to which it's possible for an artist simply to copy the style of Mondrian or Cézanne.
Not copying literally.
Not copying the painting, but the style. Is there a difference between what a computer or a brain programmed for this kind of an activity can do and what an artist could do voluntarily?
Well, I think there's a difference. The hypothesis is that the computer might be able to do this sort of thing better. That's all. It's a very easy matter to write a program for a computer so that a Mondrian that already exists can be plotted with certain numerical values or sign values attached, so that we know how to transfer this in terms of paint. In fact, we could have specified the type of canvas, its thickness, its dimensions, and all of this could be done very easily. We could have all the numerical data to which all the physical attributes of an extant Mondrian correspond. It's a very different matter to abstract from a series of paintings that already exist certain principles by which they can be examined or analyzed stylistically, and then from this material to be able to construct a new painting that is consistent with them or with many of them, and yet that had not existed before. This seems to me to be a very different procedure and a little bit more clear-cut and honest than an artist simply faking a Mondrian. As a matter of fact, with Mondrian, there were experiments with people who thought that they could do it or that their 5-year-old children could do it as well as Mondrian did. And in fact, it's a pretty easy job to decide which ones Mondrian did.
Mrs. Wendyel, since we know that at the very beginning of civilization, man relegated to himself the claim that he is a moral creature and tried very hard to prove by various means such as making gods in his own image and religions and fostering moral and ethical codes. And since we came to the 20th century and find that he has failed in his effort, do you think that there is hope that this influencing of the brain might result by chemical and electronic means, might result in making human beings more human and build a better human society by design? Since man has gained dominion over all other creatures, it would be fitting and proper that he should make himself a creature able to rule man, the solar system, the universe, the cosmos. Do you think there are hope for such a development?
I never give up hope. I think there's always hope for such a development. We have not yet, however, identified the program by which this can be, the automatic nature of this outcome can be instilled in man, however. So we're still a long way from understanding the pattern of nerve impulses that makes some of us more human or more humane than others of us. If we manage to keep ourselves going long enough, I think there's some remote chance that we might be able to identify this kind of information, and then indeed we have it made. But then I think we're going to have another kind of creature. I don't know what to call it. It won't be like man today. It'll be some new product. This might be thought of as contrived evolution, if you will. Who is it? Schill's, professor of humane thought or something at the University of Chicago, has, I think, coined the phrase contrived intervention for the activity of human beings in manipulating biological processes. And he says that much of mankind is worried, quite understandably, about the implications of this. I've just semi-coined the phrase contrived evolution, and I think this may be a possible trend which you have raised in your question.
Now perhaps you in this auditorium will excuse us while we make a little humane visit next door. And perhaps you might keep in mind as you hear our sepulchral voices from beyond the divide with regard to this question of can we make man good, that on one occasion St. Augustine is said to have prayed, "O God, make me good, but not yet."
I don't quite understand, Dr. Myer, the nature of the control that you discussed, or the nature of the implantation that you discussed. If an individual were given, say, the information, the aesthetic information of texture, of style of a given painter such as Mondrian, I don't see why he would then be able to develop paintings like Mondrian. For example, I assume that Bernhard Berenson knew as much about Florentine painting of the 14th and 15th century as anybody, yet did he ever produce such a painting? He knew as much aesthetics about it, though. Well, my question is, I don't see how he would, by the mere knowledge, which would appear to be intellectual knowledge of the aesthetics of the period, by the computer knowledge, I don't see how he could then cause himself to make these paintings.
Well, I don't see how he could do it without this knowledge. And this knowledge is not computer knowledge, it's human knowledge. And anything we program into a computer, it's the result of a very rich and complicated process of stylistic analysis, historical assessment, and formal analysis, for that matter. At no point does it seem to me that you're really very, very far away from a human element whenever you're talking about a work of art.
But isn't that precisely the mystical quantity or quality we're trying to arrive at, the fact that there's something beyond just the mere computer or intellectual knowledge necessary to perform works of art? I mean, presumably the Mondrian has something more than just a mere technique or a mere style.
I'm predisposed to agree with you emotionally, but as a research project, I think it has a great deal of value if, in point of fact, we can derive certain rules for the composition of a painting, and at the end of this process, create or produce a painting that is consistent with those rules we've set for ourselves. And if it is in every way that we have of testing such a thing, and I admit they're very hazy ways. They're the statements of experts who apparently are not aware of this project, you see. If we can produce a Mondrian that fulfills all of these conditions, then I don't see how this is really, in the end, very different from a painting that Mondrian might have done himself. I mean, I think we have a lot of sentimental attachment to the idea of originality, but in point of fact, in the 20th century, this idea has been profoundly challenged by artists themselves. And we know in other historical and cultural periods that originality or this particular expression of human involvement in the creative act have not been held in very high repute. Hence, the Chinese emperors employed copyists to work in their own courts before their very eyes. So I think there's a lot of sentimental attachment to what we think about art and the creative process that doesn't necessarily apply to all of art.
I think now we should have a question which will involve our more fundamental biological considerations, so we have time to let the aesthetics simmer a bit.
I address my question to Dr. Wenzel. You have spoken of electrical stimulation of specific brain centers to produce specific actions or results. And you have also spoken of drug stimulation of brain centers to achieve certain results. To what extent have drugs been found which are specific for a certain brain center? And secondly, have you any evidence that brain centers may individually react as shock tissues for to allergens? I have experienced sleeplessness from an allergic reaction, and I have experienced overpowering sleepiness from a different allergen. And I wonder what information you have on that.
as far as your first question is concerned, which had to do with the effect of specific drugs on specific brain structures, I'll remind you of my caveat where I said that we know really very little as yet about how drugs have the effect that they have insofar as brain activity is concerned. We have been able to identify in some cases direct target structures in the brain which are the areas primarily affected by certain drugs, and we feel that we can account for a great deal, if not all, of the action of that drug by its effect in this particular localized area. And one example that comes to mind immediately is sleeping pills, for example, the barbiturates, Seconal, Nembutal, and so forth. These place primarily upon a very important area of the brain, which is concerned, among other things, behavioral phenomena are, I would say, still poorly understood and cannot be highly specified in a pinpointed manner. As far as your second question is concerned, I'm afraid I just have to plead ignorance. I can't comment specifically on it in the way you've put it. It may be that the phenomenon you've observed could be traced to secondary effects rather than brain structures in themselves being showing an allergic reaction. They may be responding to other chemicals released by allergic processes in other parts of the body and circulating through the bloodstream. I don't know.
One more question on this side.
I wanted to ask about one of the most pleasant attributes of the mind, and that is the ability to forget. And I think the world would become very stale if we couldn't forget, and we do forget. Nothing would be very amusing for very long. Besides, I don't know anybody who hasn't got something in his head, a girl or a mother or something, say, I wish I could forget that. And here we're talking about increasing the power of the human mind, and maybe we ought to, at the same time, develop specifics for decreasing some aspects of the human mind.
Dr. Wenzel, would you like to make a comment on the power of positive forgetting?
Only to say I couldn't agree with him more.
I'm personally plagued by this because I seem to have a garbage can mind, so.
Well, on that elevated note, would you kindly excuse us? We will migrate back to the other auditorium.
I noticed that some of us seem to be left-handed and some seem to be right, which means one side of the mind or the other is more developed than the others. Is true? And the second part, if it is true, is it possible to perhaps work on the mind and develop the whole mind, both the right and the left side?
Listened of the one in the other room, which had to do with forgetting. I think it's not fair to say that left-handedness or right-handedness reflects an unequal development, or I should say a partial development. I think what it reflects, rather, is a certain degree of specialization and efficiency. It makes it possible, perhaps, to use other tissue, other brain tissue for other things, instead of having to devote more area to control of handedness. It's an oversimplification also to assume that this control is highly specialized. If you find yourself in a condition where you've lost the cells controlling your right hand are diseased, so that you lose some of this fine control, it's perfectly possible to regain it. It takes a little work, but your brain is in good enough shape, usually, to regain this control, and in addition, you can develop the other hand to a very high degree of proficiency under these circumstances. So all is not lost under these traumatic conditions. I've forgotten your other question. Oh, is it possible to develop?
One half of your mind, such as right or left-handedness, to develop the entire mind. What you do already.
Well, we do already to a great extent. This raises, you seem to be assuming that because we write with one hand, we're using only half of our brain. This is not the case at all. And this is what I meant by saying we're being kind of efficient. It's possible to think of it as localizing the control area in one half so that we can use the other half for other things. And this seems to be essentially what's happening. Well, there's a lot of evidence that gets involved for supporting this statement. I don't want to be put in the position of saying that we're doing the best we can, however. I think we can do better, but neither am I willing to buy the position that we're being unnecessarily shiftless.
Dr. von Myer, I'm not exactly sure. Is it an artist who is being programmed, or can any individual be programmed?
Well, presumably any individual could be programmed. You might have better return for your money on an artist, somebody who's had the training, the technical training, to get over this third part of the machine function, that of translating the directions received from the brain into mechanical activity to produce a work of art.
And is your fantasy such that the artist has a volition to paint as Mondrian, or can he be programmed to paint like Mondrian, whether he wishes to or not?
Well, I'm accepting Dr. Wenzel's proviso that all of this is done voluntarily at this stage. Presumably there'd be no reason why it need be done voluntarily, and that once programmed, he could paint like whomever we decided he should paint like.
One third question. On the matter of technique, you spoke of this very intricate, careful brushwork of Mondrian's, which doubtless is the product of great thought, experience, etc. Is it also your thought that this technique can be programmed into an individual artist or a non-artist?
I see no reason why it couldn't be. I mentioned this in a different context, though, that the superficial sense of impersonality should not lead us into assuming that, in fact, all of Mondrian's work is impersonal. We have it in a more extreme case with even more recent painting, where you have as a professed objective of some very serious artists to be impersonal. Andy Warhol's a case in point, where he's developed the silk screen method of painting explicitly as a statement of the impersonality of his artistic stance. You have this, as I suggested already, in Marcel Duchamp 50 years ago, where the replication, anyway, if not reproduction, of individual works of art that would be frowned upon by the traditional 19th century artists, which is to say most contemporary artists today still, who take this 19th century stance of the individual creative romantic genius who creates this thing which is a work of art. This has been severely attacked by artists themselves, who are no longer interested in this sentimental sort of originality. The paradox is that Warhol, in creating silkscreen paintings of images taken by photographers other than himself, in having helpers make these paintings rather than doing it himself. He does it himself, but he also has other people help him. Oh, I don't think so. I think, in fact, that with the change in the market nature of the fine arts in the last 10 years, anyway, in the last 20 years, there have been very significant changes, and you'll find that fads really don't operate any longer, at least not in the sense that we had a succession of styles that would be in or out of favor. Nowadays, there's a very high degree of pluralism, I suppose you'd call it, where all styles can coexist and can command increasingly high market values, some at different rates than others. But I don't think Warhols will ever lose their value.
Let's not concentrate our valuable computers on such mundane things as the marketplace.
Dr. Wenzel, as a result of work going on in many fields, we've developed a pretty substantial theory of automatic control. Examples are the equipment that has been developed for control of space-age devices, the delicate controls of airplanes and automatic flight control programs, etc. Now, all of these, what I call mechanistic models for automatic control, have in common the property that they don't have any element of unpredictability in them. In other words, they're involuntary, completely predictable devices working according to pre-planned design. And a great many of our mental and neurological functions are of this type that can't be doubted. But we pride ourselves on having a consciousness and an ability to exercise free choice. And I was wondering what is the status of the development of mechanistic models for conscience, or consciousness rather, mechanistic models for consciousness. Do you believe that there is the possibility of having a completely mechanistic explanation for consciousness? And what will this do to our cherished free choice?
We could debate for some time just what our cherished free choice actually consists of course. We're inherently programmed. I thought some people have said that the only difference is that now the programming is essentially willy-nilly, and maybe it would be better if it were more carefully planned. To some extent, we have the capacity for this kind of programming now in human beings in controlling early experience and also the possibility of controlling genetics. But this is a little bit different from what you were talking about. I really don't think I can answer that. I'm not fully acquainted with the with developments in control theory from the engineering and mathematical point of view. So what those people now think they're capable of doing, I don't know. As far as the biologist is concerned, two thoughts go through my mind. One is that, for the most part, I think it would be a fair summary to say that a mechanistic model of consciousness, as you've put it, is not on the immediate horizon. Although they would not deny the possibility that the phenomenon of consciousness is ultimately explicable in mechanistic terms. And here, by mechanistic terms, let's say physicalistic terms. On the other hand, there's a certain group of biologists even, and I mean no offense when I say they tend to be the older ones, who come around to denying this possibility as ever being likely. So a very famous biologist gave an invited speech in England recently, and this is a very famous neurophysiologist who's won the Nobel Prize and has been honored in many ways, and he said in this speech that as far as he was concerned, it would never be possible, he did not see how it would be possible to discuss self-identity, by which I assume he meant consciousness, in the same terms as we use to talk about neuronal action and nervous impulse and so forth. I tend to think that they feel after a lifetime of productivity, if they haven't seen an inkling of how to do it, they think it's not going to be possible to do it. I don't know at what age this sets in, but I haven't gotten there yet.
In some way, this seems to touch on the mechanical model problem that I mentioned, the relationship or the possibility of an analog between the human brain and a machine. One of the reasons for doubting this eventually is supplied to us, fortunately, by mathematics itself, and it's part of the Entscheidungsproblem posited by David Hilbert, and answered Hilbert's position anyway by Kurt Gödel, the fact that if any system is at least large enough and complex enough to include arithmetic and whole numbers, that it is in fact impossible to prove that that system is consistent using elements of that system itself. So that in effect this opens a sort of back door for mysticism, if you like, and makes us very comfortable in accepting this mechanical model.
Dr. von Myer, you mentioned the creative attitude and the creative participation of the viewer with works of art. My question is, are not the masses of viewers already being subjected to a certain amount of programming in the type of censorship that we're being subjected to today?
Oh yes, well, my attitude is that viewers really aren't subjected to anything. They do this by choice, except, as you say, censorship, which is a negative action that prohibits you from seeing certain things that otherwise you might choose either to see or not to see. In this sense, there is control. This is a pretty crude sort of social control in contrast to the types of controls envisaged on the basis of Dr. Wenzel's implications. This has always been with us, too. I mean, 100 years ago, paintings were refused exhibition. Courbet's paintings were refused exhibition at the World's Fair, the International Exposition in Paris. And these are paintings which are very staid for the most part today. See, there's a long history of this. It's very depressing, of course. But.
Is there a question over on this side? We have time for one more. Maybe somebody would like to come down to the front.
Dr. Wenzel, you talked about the proviso of voluntarism and human freedom in these different experiments, and yet you talked about control. I wondered if, I know you're speaking in the behavioristic field, I wonder if you carry this over to personality theory a little bit, it wouldn't lead logically to something like B.F. Skinner's Walden 2, where all the human beings would be controlled. And along the same lines, someone like Carl Rogers is very interested in the scientific evaluation of psychology, and yet he wants to preserve human freedom. So how would you explain your wishing to preserve human freedom with neuron control?
Well, first of all, remember that Skinner in Walden 2, or Skinner believes basically what I mentioned before in my references to free choice, to the debatability of free choice. Skinner believes that we're all controlled anyway. The important thing is that we might as well be controlled for the good and as agreeably as possible, instead of in this somewhat random and hence often undesirable manner in which we're now controlled. So I really don't think it's a matter of whether we're controlled or not. The fact is we are. And what this brings up, what the operations that I've been talking about bring up, is simply the possibility of directed and deliberate control. So the debate perhaps then resolves itself as to the desirability of this, and I'm not about to open that debate on a personal basis right now.
On the subject of consciousness, the only consciousness that I'm really aware of is my own, and it's just by generosity that I extend it to other human beings and possibly to cats and dogs. And if somebody gave me a list of symptoms of consciousness that they would use as a test or a criterion, I could certainly program a computer to give all the right responses. And the question I'd really like to ask is, what reasonable tests are there? If somebody brings in his robot and says it's conscious, how would you really test it to decide whether it was or not?
I think this is something you might well spend quite a bit of time debating, and perhaps write a doctoral dissertation on it if you don't already have one. I think the more important thing to worry about is the content of consciousness than the existence of consciousness. I know of no set of criteria for consciousness that everyone would agree on. There's no way to get a good argument started at a cocktail party or in a bull session than what is consciousness. What we're more concerned with in this kind of consideration of biological prospects is what's going to be contained within these shall we say, controlled brains of the future. To a certain extent, I suppose, consciousness to many people implies at least an apparent free choice and voluntarism, and I think it's possible to include that. If you can control a brain to the extent that we've been loosely considering, you can make them feel that they're making their own choices. That's no problem.
I think on that excellent note, we should call an evening's discussion concluded. Perhaps Dr. Wenzel has finished the evening by giving us an illustration of one of the benign ways in which we can welcome control of our hearts. I wish to welcome you all back again next week and remind you that we have 2 more sessions. The one after next week will include Norman Corwin, who is a guest here this evening, a noted radio and screenwriter, who will make a contribution to the discussion of the new biology and human values. Till next week, good night.